Jack Morrison had survived war, buried friends, and spent nearly 5 decades believing that no battle could ever leave him completely defeated. He was wrong. At 68, the retired Army veteran stood alone beside the rusted gates of his late grandfather's abandoned dairy farm after losing almost everything he had spent a lifetime building. His retirement savings had vanished under crushing medical bills and failed investments. His house was gone. His future had become a single worn duffel bag resting in the back of an old pickup truck. The only thing he still owned was a forgotten dairy farm everyone else believed had already died. The barns were collapsing, the milking equipment hadn't worked in years, and an ancient tractor sat buried beneath dust inside a dark machine shed. Even the local mechanic took one look at it and quietly said, "That old machine will never run again." Most people thought Jack would sell the farm within weeks. After all, what could one aging veteran possibly do with broken buildings and rusted equipment? But before his grandfather passed away, Jack had made one promise he could never bring himself to break, no matter how hard life became. The Morrison family farm would never disappear while he was still alive. Then, just as he was beginning to believe everyone else might be right, he found a handwritten note hidden inside his grandfather's workshop that read, "If the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do." Jack didn't understand those words until the morning an engine that had been silent for nearly 15 years suddenly roared back to life. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below and say hello. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach around the world. If you're starting your day, I hope it brings you strength, peace, and a reason to smile. If you're listening tonight, I hope this story reminds you that it's never too late to rebuild what truly matters. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about family, forgotten legacies, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next journey together. Now, let's go back to the day Jack Morrison believed he had lost absolutely everything. Jack Morrison arrived at the farm before sunset, with everything he owned packed into the bed of an aging pickup. One worn duffel bag, 2 cardboard boxes, a framed photograph of his late wife, Sarah, a metal case holding his Army medals, which he had not opened in years. At 68, after a lifetime of service, work, and saving, he had imagined retirement would be quiet. Instead, medical bills from Sarah's final illness had consumed most of their savings, and a failed investment had taken nearly everything that remained. The house they had shared was gone. His pension covered food, fuel, and little else. The abandoned Morrison dairy farm was the only property still carrying his name. Jack stopped beside the rusted front gate and looked across land his grandfather Walter had once worked from before sunrise until long after dark. The pasture fences leaned at tired angles. Weeds swallowed the gravel drive. The main barn had lost several roof panels, and one side of the milking shed sagged toward the ground. People in town had told him the property was worth more sold in pieces than saved as a farm. Jack understood their reasoning. He simply could not accept it. He pushed the gate open, drove slowly toward the farmhouse, and parked beneath an old maple tree. The porch steps groaned beneath his boots. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wood, and years of closed windows. Walter's coat still hung beside the kitchen door, stiff with age. A chipped blue mug rested upside down near the sink. Jack stood in the silence, remembering childhood mornings when the farmhouse had been filled with boiling coffee, radio weather reports, and his grandfather's voice telling him that cows never cared whether a man was tired. "They still need feeding," Walter would say. "That's how responsibility works." Jack carried his belongings into the bedroom upstairs. He placed Sarah's photograph on the dresser, then sat on the edge of the narrow bed. For the first time since leaving the army, he had no clear orders, no dependable plan, and no one waiting for him to be strong. His daughter Emily had called twice during the drive. She wanted him to sell the farm and move closer to her. "You've already lost enough," she had said. Jack knew she spoke from love, not doubt. But her words followed him through every empty room. After unpacking, he walked toward the barns before darkness settled. A section of fencing collapsed when he touched it. The dairy parlor was worse than he expected. Rust covered the pipelines. Rubber hoses had cracked. Control boxes hung open with wires exposed. He tested one switch, but nothing happened. In the feed room, rainwater had damaged sacks left behind long ago. Every practical detail argued against him. Repairs would cost more than he had. Reopening would require equipment, animals, inspections, and help he could not afford. A truck slowed on the county road. Two men inside glanced toward the property before driving on. Jack recognized the expression even from a distance. Curiosity mixed with certainty that he would not last. He returned to the farmhouse workshop as night gathered outside. The room had once been Walter's favorite place, filled with tools he used to repair anything from milk pumps to tractor engines. Now dust covered the workbench, and spiders had claimed the corners. Jack found a broom and began cleaning because the rhythm gave him something useful to do. Beneath a pile of cracked manuals, he discovered a small wooden box. Inside were drill bits, rusted bolts, and a folded paper bearing his name. The handwriting stopped him. Walter had been gone for 16 years, but Jack recognized every firm stroke. He unfolded the note carefully. "Jack, if the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do." That was all. No date, no explanation. Jack read it twice, then a third time. Walter had owned several tractors over the years. Most had been sold after his death. Jack could not understand why his grandfather would connect the future of the farm to one machine, especially one no longer capable of working. He placed the note in his shirt pocket and searched the workshop for another page, but found nothing. Outside, the last light faded beyond the pasture. Jack locked the farmhouse and walked toward the machine shed at the far end of the yard. Its doors resisted until he forced one open enough to enter. Moonlight slipped through holes in the roof, revealing broken implements and shelves of forgotten parts. At the back, beneath a canvas stiff with dust, stood an old green tractor. Its tires were flat. Rust covered the hood. Vines had crept through the wall and wrapped around one rear wheel. Jack pulled away the canvas and rested a hand on the cold metal. He remembered riding beside Walter as a boy, both hands gripping the fender while the engine carried them across the pasture. Now the machine looked beyond repair. Yet inside his pocket, Walter's impossible message seemed to wait for an answer. The first full morning on the Morrison dairy farm began before sunrise. Jack Morrison woke to the same habit that had carried him through decades of military service. Long before daylight reached the hills, he had already made coffee on the old farmhouse stove and stepped onto the porch. Cool morning air drifted across the empty pasture. Once, the sound of dairy cows greeting the day had echoed through these fields. Now only the wind moved through broken fence posts and tall grass. Jack unfolded Walter's note once again. "If the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do." He read the sentence slowly before folding it back into his shirt pocket. The words made no more sense than they had the night before, but they gave him something to carry besides uncertainty. He picked up a pair of worn leather gloves from the workshop and walked toward the largest barn. Years of neglect covered every surface. Loose boards leaned against walls. Rusted buckets lay scattered beneath broken windows, and old hay had hardened into dusty piles along the floor. Jack didn't try imagining the entire farm restored. He simply reached for the nearest broken board and carried it outside. Army life had taught him that impossible missions became possible, one small task at a time. By mid-morning, he had cleared enough debris to open the wide barn doors completely. Sunlight spilled across the old dairy equipment, revealing rows of rusted pipes, cracked hoses, and silent machines that had not operated in years. Jack examined the milking system carefully. The vacuum lines were brittle. Electrical panels showed signs of water damage. Motors were frozen with corrosion. Every inspection led to the same conclusion. Repairing the farm would require far more than determination. As he stepped outside for a drink of water, an old pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. A young man climbed out carrying a weathered metal toolbox. He looked no older than 18. "Mr. Morrison?" Jack nodded. "That's me." "I'm Tyler Reed." Jack recognized the surname immediately. "Frank Reed's grandson?" Tyler smiled. "Yes, sir. Grandpa heard you came back." Jack leaned against the porch railing. "What did he say?" Tyler laughed softly. "He said your grandfather would have been disappointed if nobody offered to help." Jack smiled for the first time that morning. That sounds like Walter. Tyler glanced toward the barns. "I've been learning diesel mechanics at the vocational school. I'm still new at it, but I enjoy working on old equipment." Jack looked across the yard before answering. "I can't pay you. I didn't come for money." "Then why?" Tyler shrugged. "Because somebody once fixed my granddad's tractor when he couldn't afford it. He says your grandfather never sent a bill." Jack studied the young man for a moment before extending his hand. "Then I'd appreciate another pair of hands." They spent the rest of the morning clearing the workshop attached to the dairy barn. Walter had apparently believed almost nothing should ever be thrown away. Shelves overflowed with bolts sorted into glass jars, worn belts hung neatly from wooden pegs, and faded manuals filled old cabinets. Tyler picked up a rusted wrench and smiled. "Your grandpa organized everything." Jack nodded. "He always said a man wastes less time if he knows where to find what he already owns." They carried broken scrap into separate piles while setting aside anything that still looked useful. Dust covered nearly every surface, but beneath it, the workshop slowly revealed itself as a place built for repairing almost anything. Tyler stopped beside a heavy steel toolbox tucked beneath an old workbench. The red paint had almost disappeared beneath rust. "I don't think this one's been opened in years." Together they lifted it onto the bench. The hinges resisted before finally giving way with a loud creak. Instead of tools, the box held stacks of grease-stained notebooks tied neatly with worn string. Jack untied the first bundle and opened the top notebook. Every page contained careful handwriting, dates, equipment models, farm names, repair notes. Walter had documented every job in remarkable detail. Tyler picked up another notebook. "These aren't personal journals." Jack turned another page. "Maintenance records." They spread several notebooks across the workbench. One described replacing transmission gears during hay season. Another listed repairs to broken milking pumps after winter storms. Others recorded engine rebuilds, hydraulic repairs, fence machinery, generators, feed mixers, and tractors. The entries stretched back year after year. Tyler flipped through another notebook before frowning. Something's missing. Jack looked over. What? There's no price. Jack checked several pages himself. Every repair listed the owner, the machine, the work completed, and the date. Non-listed payment. He opened another notebook. Still nothing. No invoices, he said quietly. Tyler examined 3 more. Not even labor charges. Jack rested one hand on the worn pages. Walter had repaired equipment for decades. Hundreds of repairs filled the notebooks. Yet nowhere did he ask anyone to pay him. The workshop telephone suddenly rang, startling both of them. Jack answered after a moment. Hello. A warm voice replied. Jack, this is Martha Collins. Jack smiled. Martha, it's been a long time. The retired county historian laughed gently. Small towns hear everything. Someone told me you were cleaning Walter's workshop. I'm finding things I didn't know existed. Mind if I stop by? Please do. Less than an hour later, Martha arrived carrying a canvas satchel filled with reading glasses and notepads. She carefully examined the stacks of notebooks spread across the workbench. Her expression slowly shifted from curiosity to amazement. Goodness, she whispered. These cover nearly 40 years. Jack looked surprised. That many? Martha nodded while checking dates. Your grandfather documented almost his entire working life. Tyler glanced toward the growing piles. He fixed equipment for all these farms. Martha smiled softly, and apparently never asked for payment. Silence settled across the workshop. Jack imagined Walter spending countless evenings exactly where they stood, repairing machines so neighboring families could survive another season. Yet he had never spoken about any of it. As the afternoon light faded through the dusty windows, Tyler picked up the oldest notebook remaining on the bench. He turned several pages before stopping. Mr. Morrison, he said quietly, you should look at this. Jack stepped beside him. The same words appeared again and again throughout years of maintenance records. No model number, no serial number, no explanation. Only 2 simple words repeated dozens of times in Walter's familiar handwriting. Old tractor. The words old tractor stayed on Jack Morrison's mind long after Tyler had closed the final notebook. They appeared too often to be ordinary maintenance records. Walter had carefully listed repairs for combines, balers, milk pumps, generators, and dozens of tractors belonging to neighboring farms. Yet only one machine had been written exactly the same way every time, as though its name alone needed no further explanation. Jack slid the notebook carefully into a clean cardboard box with the others. Looks like Grandpa wanted someone to notice it, he said quietly. Tyler nodded. I just don't know why. Martha adjusted her glasses and rested one hand on the weathered pages. Sometimes old records answer questions you didn't know to ask. Jack smiled faintly. Then I suppose we better start asking. The following morning, Jack and Tyler loaded several notebooks into the pickup before driving toward the first address listed inside the oldest maintenance log. The farmhouse belonged to Harold Benson, an 84-year-old retired dairy farmer who still lived on the land where 3 generations of his family had raised cattle. Harold welcomed them onto the porch with a firm handshake, despite walking with a cane. Jack Morrison, he said with a warm smile, you look more like Walter every year. Jack laughed softly. I've been hearing that a lot lately. They settled around a small wooden table overlooking green pasture that had once been filled with Holstein cows. Jack opened one notebook and turned it toward Harold. We found these in Grandpa's workshop. Harold studied the familiar handwriting for only a few seconds before smiling. I'd recognize Walter's notes anywhere. Jack pointed toward an entry from nearly 35 years earlier. He rebuilt your feed mixer. Harold chuckled. Overnight. The notebook doesn't mention payment. Harold looked surprised. Payment? He shook his head. Your grandfather would have laughed if I'd offered. Jack leaned forward. He repaired equipment for free. Harold looked toward the distant hills before answering. The gearbox broke 2 days before harvest. If it hadn't been fixed immediately, I'd have lost nearly my entire feed crop. Walter worked until sunrise, refused every dollar I tried giving him, then told me to help somebody else when I had the chance. Jack remained quiet. The story sounded remarkably similar to dozens of notebook entries. Before leaving, Harold disappeared briefly into the house and returned carrying a faded envelope. I kept this all these years. Inside rested a handwritten thank you letter from Harold's late wife, thanking Walter for saving their family farm during one of the hardest seasons they had ever faced. Walter's reply had been written across the bottom in simple handwriting. Neighbors don't keep score. Jack carefully returned the letter. Thank you for showing me. Thank Walter, Harold replied gently. Their next visit took them to the Morgan family farm, where 80-year-old Ruth Morgan greeted them beside an old red barn. When Jack explained why they had come, Ruth smiled immediately. Your grandfather fixed our tractor after the flood. Jack opened another notebook and found the repair. The work had taken 3 days. Again, no payment appeared. Ruth laughed softly. My husband tried slipping money into Walter's toolbox. Did he take it? No. She smiled through distant memories. He tucked it back into my husband's coat pocket before leaving. Jack asked the same question he had asked Harold. Why? Ruth looked toward the empty pasture where dairy cattle had once grazed. Because he said if our farm survived, the whole community was stronger. Every conversation revealed another piece of the same picture. Walter had repaired broken machinery before planting season, during harvest, after storms, and whenever disasters struck neighboring farms. He never seemed concerned with making money. He simply believed no family should lose an entire season because one machine failed at the wrong time. Driving back toward the Morrison farm that afternoon, Jack kept replaying every story in his mind. I thought I knew my grandfather, he admitted. Tyler watched the road ahead. Maybe you knew him as family. Jack nodded slowly. Not as the man everyone else remembers. Over the following days, more families welcomed them. Some produced faded photographs showing Walter standing beside repaired tractors. Others shared handwritten notes, Christmas cards, and letters thanking him for late-night repairs that had carried them through impossible years. None mentioned invoices. None mentioned payment. Every story centered on kindness quietly given and quickly forgotten by the man who offered it. One elderly farmer smiled as he handed Jack a folded letter preserved inside clear plastic. Walter told me to burn this after reading it. Jack raised an eyebrow. You didn't? The old man laughed. Best decision I ever made. The letter thanked Walter for repairing a hay baler after the owner's son had been injured in an accident. Without that repair, the family would have lost their entire winter feed supply. Jack folded the letter carefully before returning it. I never knew any of this. Your grandfather wasn't trying to build a reputation, the farmer replied. He was trying to keep people farming. Those words stayed with Jack as he and Tyler returned to the workshop each evening. Between visits, they continued clearing shelves and organizing Walter's tools. The machine shed slowly transformed from a forgotten storage building into a working repair shop once again. Tyler spent spare moments examining the old tractor beneath the dust-covered canvas. though he made no serious attempt to start it yet. "One thing at a time," Jack reminded him. Tyler grinned. "That's what you always say."
It's worked so far.
Late one afternoon, while sweeping beneath a row of old cabinets along the back wall of the machine shed, Tyler noticed fresh scrape marks on the wooden floor. "Mr. Morrison," he called, "come look at this." Jack walked over. One tall metal cabinet appeared slightly different from the others. Dust covered every surface except the narrow outline where it had apparently been moved years earlier. Together, they pushed it aside several inches, revealing a small wooden door built directly into the wall behind it. The old brass lock had long since rusted, but the hinges still held firm. Jack carefully pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow storage compartment barely large enough for shelves. Most contained neatly labeled boxes of spare parts. At the very bottom stood a single locked wooden cabinet, no larger than a bedside table. Tyler examined the brass latch. "This one's different." Jack tried the handle. It refused to move. Tyler searched nearby shelves until he found a small key taped beneath one of Walter's old coffee tins. It fit perfectly. The cabinet door opened slowly. Resting alone on the middle shelf was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but carefully protected from dust and moisture. Across the front, written in Walter Morrison's unmistakable handwriting, were only a few words. For Jack. "Open when you're ready to quit." Asterisk. Jack stared at the sealed envelope for a long moment before reaching for it. Tyler stood quietly beside him, while the afternoon sunlight slipped through cracks in the machine shed roof, leaving narrow beams across the dusty floor. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. For Jack. "Open when you're ready to quit." Jack smiled faintly. Grandpa always did know me better than I knew myself. He carefully broke the brittle seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. The paper had yellowed with age, but Walter's steady handwriting remained clear. Jack, if you've opened this letter, I'm guessing you're standing in the workshop wondering whether the farm is worth saving. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're worried. Maybe you've convinced yourself the buildings are too old, the machines are too broken, or you've simply run out of reasons to keep trying. I've had those thoughts myself more times than I can count. But here's something the Army never taught me, and farming finally did. Machines can almost always be repaired. Hope is different. Hope only comes back when someone decides it is worth choosing again. You'll spend money you don't have. You'll fix things that break twice. Some mornings you'll wonder whether you've accomplished anything at all. Keep going anyway. Not because every repair succeeds, but because every honest effort tells someone else they're not alone. That's what this farm was built for. If you ever reach the point where quitting seems easier than trying again, take one more step before making your decision. Sometimes that's all a new season needs. Jack lowered the final page without speaking. Tyler waited patiently before asking, "Your grandfather wrote that just for you?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think he knew this day might come." He folded the letter with great care and placed it beside the earlier note inside his shirt pocket. Outside, the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of hayfields beyond the property. The buildings around him remained weathered. Nothing practical had changed. Yet somehow the burden felt lighter than it had only minutes before. The following days brought difficult reminders that determination alone could not restore a dairy farm. Jack began making lists of everything requiring repair before the property could ever operate again. Roofing materials, electrical wiring, milking equipment, water pumps, fence posts, plumbing, feed storage. Every estimate exceeded what he could reasonably afford. His remaining savings continued shrinking with every necessary purchase. One afternoon, he sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by receipts and handwritten calculations. He erased the same figures several times before finally setting the pencil aside. Even if he repaired the buildings, replacing the aging dairy system would cost more than he had left. He reached into his pocket and unfolded Walter's letter once again. Take one more step before making your decision. Jack smiled quietly. I'm trying, Grandpa. A familiar car pulled into the driveway the next morning. Emily stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags and hurried across the porch before wrapping her father in a long embrace. You look thinner, she said. Jack laughed softly. That's your way of saying hello? It's my way of saying I'm worried. They carried the groceries into the kitchen together. Emily looked around the farmhouse, noticing the freshly cleaned floors, organized shelves, and sunlight pouring through windows that had once been covered with dust. You've already done a lot, she admitted. There's still plenty left. After lunch, they walked slowly through the property. Emily listened as Jack explained the maintenance notebooks, the stories shared by neighboring farmers, and the letters thanking Walter for helping families survive difficult seasons. She smiled at each discovery, but concern remained in her eyes whenever she looked at the aging barns. Dad, she said gently, I understand why this place matters. Jack nodded. I know you do. But I also know what you've already been through. They stopped beside the silent dairy parlor. Emily rested one hand on the weathered railing. You lost Mom. You lost your retirement. You lost your house. I don't want this farm taking everything else. Jack looked toward the pasture where his grandfather had once worked from dawn until sunset. Neither do I. Emily took a slow breath. If you sold the property now, you'd still have enough to start over somewhere smaller. You could live closer to me. Jack smiled warmly at his daughter. You've thought this through. Every day. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're trying to protect me. Tears gathered in Emily's eyes. Of course I am. Jack nodded toward the barns. But every person I've met these past 2 weeks has told me a story I never knew about Grandpa. Emily remained silent. He didn't keep this place alive because it was easy, Jack continued. He kept it alive because people needed it. Emily looked across the fields for a long moment. I just don't want you chasing something impossible. Jack smiled softly. Neither do I. They embraced before returning to the farmhouse, neither convincing the other, yet both understanding the conversation came from love rather than disagreement. Over the next several afternoons, Tyler devoted every spare hour after vocational classes to the workshop, while Jack focused on repairing barn doors and clearing the milking area. Tyler quietly inspected the old tractor piece by piece. He drained contaminated fuel, removed rusted filters, cleaned electrical connections, and carefully labeled every part spread across the workbench. Jack noticed the growing collection one evening. You've been busy. Tyler grinned. Mostly cleaning. Think it'll ever run? Tyler looked toward the silent machine. I honestly don't know. He paused before adding, but I'd like to find out. Jack smiled. Fair enough. Days later, after replacing one final wiring connection, Tyler climbed into the faded driver's seat. Jack stood beside the open engine compartment, watching carefully. Ready? Tyler asked. Jack nodded. Tyler turned the ignition key. For one long second, nothing happened. Then a slow metallic sound echoed through the shed. The starter motor groaned. The engine turned once, then fell silent again. Tyler looked at Jack with wide eyes. Jack stared at the tractor, hardly believing what he had heard. After nearly 15 years without life, the old engine had finally answered with its first reluctant breath. The sound of the starter turning over lingered in the workshop long after the engine had fallen silent again. Tyler slowly released the ignition key and looked across the hood of the old tractor at Jack. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The machine had not started, but it had answered. After nearly 15 years without movement, something deep inside the engine had awakened. Jack rested one hand against the worn fender, remembering Walter's handwritten note folded safely inside his shirt pocket. If the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do. For the first time, those words no longer felt impossible. "She's trying," Tyler said quietly. Jack nodded. "So are we." The next morning they returned to the workshop with renewed determination. Tyler continued cleaning fuel lines, replacing brittle wiring, and carefully soaking rusted bolts before attempting to remove them. Jack focused on restoring the workshop itself, organizing Walter's tools so every wrench, socket, and puller once again had a proper place. The old building slowly began looking less like a forgotten shed and more like the repair shop it had once been. Before long, neighbors began stopping by more often. Some came simply to see the old tractor that had almost turned over. Others arrived carrying small items they believed might still be useful. One retired farmer delivered a cabinet full of carefully preserved hand tools. Another brought unopened cans of grease and hydraulic fluid that had been sitting unused in his barn for years. No one expected payment. They simply placed the supplies inside the workshop and quietly wished Jack good luck. One afternoon, a familiar pickup pulled into the driveway. Ben Harris stepped out carrying several cardboard boxes. As owner of the county's largest farm equipment dealership, Ben had spent years supplying modern machinery to farms across the region. He had been among those who believed restoring the Morrison dairy farm made little financial sense. Walking through the workshop, he stopped beside the old tractor and smiled. "I heard it turned over." Tyler grinned proudly. "Only once." "That's once more than last week." Ben set the boxes onto the workbench. Jack looked inside and immediately recognized new ignition components, fuel filters, electrical connectors, and replacement gaskets. "Ben," he said, "this is more than I can afford." Ben shook his head. "You're not buying them." Jack frowned. "I don't take charity." Ben smiled knowingly. Neither did Walter. The words caught Jack by surprise. Ben leaned against the workbench and folded his arms. "Years ago, my father nearly lost his first tractor during harvest. Your grandfather rebuilt the transmission over one weekend and refused every dollar Dad offered." He looked around the workshop. "I figure it's about time my family returned the favor." Jack reached for one of the boxes, unable to hide his gratitude. "Thank you." Ben nodded once. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When somebody else needs help someday, you'll do the same." Jack smiled. That sounds exactly like something Grandpa would have said. Over the following weeks, the workshop became busier than either Jack or Tyler expected. Retired mechanics stopped by to offer advice. Former dairy farmers shared practical knowledge about restoring older equipment. Volunteers repaired broken windows, rebuilt shelves, and reinforced sections of the barn roof before summer storms could cause more damage. Every improvement remained small on its own, but together they slowly transformed the property. Martha Collins visited often, bringing more historical records from the county archives. Each visit seemed to uncover another forgotten story about Walter. One afternoon, she arrived carrying a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings protected inside clear plastic sleeves. "I think you'll want to see these," she said. Jack spread them across the workbench. Most articles mentioned neighboring farms recovering after machinery failures, difficult harvests, or harsh winters. Walter's name rarely appeared. Instead, reporters described anonymous volunteers or local mechanics helping struggling families continue farming. Martha tapped one faded photograph. Barely visible in the background stood Walter beside a repaired hay baler, smiling only after everyone else had returned to work. "He always stayed out of the spotlight," she said softly. Jack looked at the photograph for a long moment. Seems he wanted the farms remembered, not himself. The stories continued arriving from every direction. One elderly couple recalled Walter repairing a milk pump after lightning destroyed their electrical system. Another family remembered him lending equipment for nearly an entire planting season, without asking when it would be returned. A retired veterinarian laughed while describing how Walter once spent 2 nights rebuilding a tractor because a young farmer had twins on the way and couldn't afford another setback. Every conversation ended the same way. Walter had simply shown up when someone needed him. The local newspaper soon heard about the restoration project through neighbors who had volunteered. A reporter visited the farm one bright Saturday morning and spent several hours walking the property. Instead of focusing only on the broken buildings, she listened as Jack described Walter's maintenance notebooks, the letters from neighboring farmers, and the growing number of volunteers who had returned because of one man's quiet kindness. Before leaving, she asked Jack why he refused to give up. He looked toward the workshop where Tyler was carefully polishing one of the tractor's old engine parts. "Because every story I've heard reminds me this farm was never built for one family alone." 2 days later, the front page carried the headline, "Old Dairy Farm Finds New Purpose Through Forgotten Legacy." The article spread quickly throughout the county. More visitors arrived. Some simply wanted to shake Jack's hand. Others came ready to work. The workshop echoed once again with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and shared experience. It felt alive in a way Jack had never imagined during his lonely first morning on the property. Yet, practical reality remained. One afternoon, Ben invited an experienced dairy equipment technician to inspect the old milking system inside the barn. The man spent nearly 2 hours examining pumps, pipelines, cooling tanks, and electrical controls before removing his cap with a thoughtful expression. Jack waited quietly. "Tell me straight," he said. The technician nodded respectfully. "The buildings can be repaired." He looked around the aging dairy parlor. "But this equipment..." He paused before finishing the sentence. "I'm not sure this system will ever be safe enough to operate again." The technician's words settled heavily inside the dairy barn long after he had driven away. Jack stood beside the silent milking system, running one hand across the cold, stainless steel pipes that had once carried thousands of gallons of milk every season. Rust had claimed fittings. Rubber seals had hardened with age. Electrical panels belonged to another era. Replacing everything would cost far more than repairing a few broken parts. Tyler quietly closed his toolbox. "I'm sorry." Jack looked toward the rows of empty stalls where dairy cows had once waited patiently every morning. "Don't be." He managed a faint smile. "I'd rather hear the truth than false hope." Even so, disappointment followed him back to the farmhouse that evening. He spread estimates across the kitchen table beside Walter's letters and the maintenance notebooks. The numbers refused to change no matter how many times he added them. Roof repairs, electrical work, plumbing, cooling equipment, sanitation upgrades. Every page reminded him how much still stood between an abandoned farm and a working dairy. He reached into his pocket and unfolded Walter's letter once again. Machines can almost always be repaired. Hope is different. Hope only comes back when someone decides it is worth choosing again. Jack smiled quietly before folding the paper again. "One more step," he whispered. "Just one more." The following Saturday, volunteers arrived before sunrise without being asked. Ben Harris backed his flatbed trailer into the yard, carrying lumber and replacement steel beams. Retired carpenters unloaded saws while former dairy farmers inspected the old milking barn with experienced eyes. Tyler organized tools across the workshop benches, assigning small jobs to anyone willing to help. No speeches were made. Everyone simply found work that needed doing. Jack watched for a moment from the porch, overwhelmed by the sight. A month earlier, he had believed he was facing the impossible alone. Now the property echoed with conversation, hammer blows, and the sound of people determined to give the old farm another chance. Ben walked over carrying a pair of work gloves. "You planning to supervise all day?" Jack laughed. Not a chance. They spent the morning replacing damaged support posts beneath one side of the milking barn. Others repaired sections of roof that had leaked for years. Broken windows were removed and replaced. Old feed troughs were cleaned and reinforced instead of discarded. Tyler carefully labeled every reusable mechanical component so nothing that could still serve another purpose would be wasted. During lunch beneath the shade of the maple tree, Martha Collins arrived carrying another archive box from the County Historical Society. "I found something interesting," she said, setting the box on the picnic table. Inside rested several newspaper clippings preserved inside protective sleeves. Jack recognized Walter immediately in one faded photograph, though his grandfather stood almost hidden behind a group of smiling farmers. The headline described volunteers repairing farm machinery after a devastating flood nearly 30 years earlier. Walter's name never appeared in the article itself. Martha pointed toward another clipping. This one described tornado damage that had destroyed equipment across neighboring counties. Again, anonymous mechanics had restored tractors and milk pumps so farms could reopen before harvest. Walter appeared only as a blurred figure in the background. "He kept disappearing from his own story," Jack observed. Martha smiled. "I don't think he wanted the story to be about him." They continued reading together. Article after article described natural disasters, failing equipment, and struggling families whose farms somehow survived because someone quietly repaired what had broken. Jack recognized names from the maintenance notebooks. Every newspaper account matched another handwritten entry recorded in Walter's careful script. Emily arrived later that afternoon after calling to say she wanted to see the progress for herself. She stepped from her car expecting another quiet visit, and instead found neighbors repairing roofs, mechanics rebuilding pumps, and volunteers cleaning every corner of the dairy barn. She walked slowly through the property, greeting people who smiled as though they had known her for years. Jack met her near the workshop. "Quite a difference from your last visit." Emily looked around in amazement. "I wasn't expecting this." He handed her one of Martha's newspaper clippings. Emily read silently before opening another, then another. "These are all Grandpa?" Martha nodded. "He helped after floods, storms, equipment failures, and droughts. Most people never realized the same man kept showing up." Emily sat quietly on the workshop steps with a stack of articles in her lap. "I thought I knew his story." Jack smiled gently. "So did I." Over the next 2 days, Emily began organizing everything Martha had uncovered. She sorted photographs by year, matched newspaper articles to Walter's maintenance notebooks, and carefully labeled old letters from neighboring families. Before long, the farmhouse dining room had become a temporary archive filled with pieces of forgotten local history. Tyler walked in carrying another bundle of notebooks and stopped when he saw the growing display. "Looks like a museum." Emily smiled. "More like a family history nobody ever told." That evening, after the volunteers had gone home, father and daughter walked slowly through the repaired section of the dairy barn. Fresh lumber supported the roof where daylight had once poured through broken beams. New wiring had begun replacing damaged electrical lines. The building still required enormous work, but it no longer looked abandoned. Emily looked toward her father. "I think I understand now." Jack waited quietly. "You aren't just fixing buildings." She glanced across the barn where Walter's tools rested neatly on cleaned workbenches. "You're bringing his life back into the open." Jack nodded. "That's how it feels." Emily smiled softly. "I'd like to help document all of it. Not just for us, for everyone." Jack rested a hand on her shoulder. He would have liked that. Several days later, as work continued across the property, Ben walked toward Jack carrying a cordless phone. "Call for you." Jack answered with dusty gloves still on his hands. "Jack Morrison." A cheerful voice replied. "Mr. Morrison? My name is Laura Hayes. I'm a producer with a regional television program featuring historic farms and rural restoration projects. We've been hearing remarkable things about the Morrison Dairy Farm, and we'd like to visit if you'd be willing to share its story." The regional television crew arrived at the Morrison Dairy Farm early the following Monday, just as volunteers began another day of repairs. Laura Hayes stepped from the production van carrying a microphone while two camera operators surveyed the restored workshop, the rebuilding milking barn, and the old tractor still resting beneath the machine shed roof. Jack had nearly declined the interview. He disliked attention and feared the program would make him appear heroic when dozens of other people had done the real work. Emily convinced him otherwise. "This isn't only your story," she reminded him. "It's Grandpa's, and it belongs to everyone he helped." Jack finally agreed on one condition. "Show the people doing the work. Don't make this about one old veteran trying to save himself." Laura smiled. "That sounds like the reason the story matters." Filming continued throughout the day. The cameras followed Tyler as he cleaned decades of corrosion from the tractor's fuel system. Ben Harris explained how local mechanics had begun sharing tools and replacement parts. Martha Collins displayed Walter's maintenance notebooks, old newspaper photographs, and letters from farming families whose equipment he had repaired without payment. Emily spoke about discovering a side of her grandfather that even the family had never fully understood. When Laura interviewed Jack beside the dairy barn, she asked why he continued despite the cost and uncertainty. Jack looked toward the volunteers working beneath the repaired roof. "I came here because this farm was all I had left," he answered. "Then I learned it was never mine alone. My grandfather spent 40 years keeping other farms alive. People are helping now because kindness has a longer memory than most of us realize." The feature aired 3 evenings later. Jack watched from the farmhouse living room with Emily, Tyler, Martha, and several volunteers crowded around Walter's old television. The program showed weathered barns slowly becoming useful again, veterans replacing fence posts beside teenage mechanics, and retired farmers teaching younger volunteers how to rebuild equipment no longer covered by modern manuals. It ended with a close view of Walter's handwritten sentence: "A good farm feeds family. A great farm helps neighbors feed theirs." For several moments after the broadcast, nobody spoke. Then Tyler smiled. Your grandfather would probably complain they showed too much of him. Jack laughed softly. He'd turn off the television and tell us to get back to work. By sunrise the following morning, the farm telephone had already begun ringing. Mechanics from neighboring counties offered specialized tools. Dairy farmers volunteered spare equipment. Veterans groups asked whether they could organize weekend work crews. Some callers had never heard of Walter Morrison before watching the program. Others remembered fathers or grandfathers returning home with repaired machinery after visiting his workshop decades earlier. Vehicles began arriving before lunch. A retired Army mechanic drove nearly 80 miles carrying diagnostic equipment. 2 former dairy operators brought stainless steel piping salvaged from a recently upgraded barn. A group of veterans repaired damaged pasture fencing with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to working as a team. Farmers arrived with trailers full of lumber, pumps, electrical panels, and usable equipment that had been gathering dust in storage sheds. Jack thanked each person personally, though gratitude never seemed enough. Several viewers mailed checks or arrived carrying envelopes of cash. Jack returned every one. When Laura called to ask why, he answered carefully, "I'm not rebuilding this farm by collecting money from strangers." "But people want to help," she said. "Then let them help someone beside them." Jack paused. "If they have a skill we can use, a spare part, or a few hours to work, the gate is open. But I won't turn Walter's legacy into a fundraiser." His response became part of a follow-up news segment after that. Fewer envelopes arrived, and more people came wearing work boots. The workshop quickly became the busiest place on the property. Retired mechanics taught Tyler how to rebuild pumps and test electrical systems. Farmers brought broken equipment of their own, and Jack insisted that anyone with available time help repair those machines too. "We aren't saving one farm by ignoring another," he said. Soon, Walter's benches were covered with carburetors, hydraulic valves, starter motors, and tools borrowed from half the county. The building once again sounded as Jack remembered from childhood, metal striking metal, engines coughing back to life, and neighbors trading stories while waiting for parts. One afternoon, an elderly farmer watched Tyler repair a damaged fuel pump, then quietly told Jack, "This is exactly how Walter's shop used to feel." Jack looked across the room at volunteers working shoulder to shoulder. Maybe that's what he meant when he said the farm still had work to do. Emily continued organizing Walter's history inside the farmhouse, but she increasingly joined the physical work outside. She created schedules, matched volunteers with tasks, and coordinated donated equipment so nothing was wasted. Jack noticed she had stopped talking about selling the property. Instead, she asked questions about milk contracts, herd sizes, inspection requirements, and long-term operations. One evening, they sat together on the porch after the last volunteers had left. "How long can you stay?" Jack asked. Emily looked across the repaired fences glowing in the sunset. "I've been wondering about that." He waited. "My job can be done remotely most of the week," she continued. "I could spend more time here." Jack tried not to sound too hopeful. "You thinking about moving back?" Emily smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about what home means." Before Jack could answer, a sharp metallic sound came from the machine shed. They both stood. Inside, Tyler was alone beside the old tractor, checking a newly installed fuel line. "I didn't touch the ignition," he said as Jack and Emily hurried in. The tractor shuddered once. Then the starter engaged without anyone in the seat. Tyler stepped back in astonishment. The engine coughed, hesitated, and suddenly exploded into a deep, powerful roar that filled the entire workshop. Dust shook from the rafters as the old tractor continued running on its own for the first time in nearly 15 years. The deep rumble of the old tractor echoed across the Morrison farm long after Tyler reached forward and carefully pulled the throttle back. The engine settled into a steady idle, its familiar rhythm filling the workshop with a sound that many people in the county had not heard in more than a decade. Nobody moved for several seconds. Jack stood beside the front tire with one hand resting against the warm metal hood. Emily covered her mouth, unable to hide her smile. Tyler looked from the tractor to Jack, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't expect that today," he admitted quietly. Jack laughed, the first carefree laugh he had allowed himself in months. "Neither did I." He reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded Walter's first note once again. "If the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do." This time, the words no longer felt mysterious. They felt like an invitation. News traveled through the county faster than anyone expected. Before evening, neighbors began stopping along the driveway after hearing that Walter Morrison's old tractor had finally come back to life. Some simply stood in the workshop listening to the engine idle while smiling to themselves. Others reached out to touch the faded green paint as though greeting an old friend. Harold Benson arrived before sunset, carrying his cane beneath one arm. He listened quietly for a moment before wiping moisture from the corner of one eye. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again," he whispered. Jack smiled. Seemed she wasn't finished yet. Harold nodded toward the tractor. Neither was Walter. During the following week, the old machine became something far greater than another repaired piece of equipment. Volunteers gathered around it before beginning each day's work, almost as though its steady engine reminded everyone why they had come. Mechanics from neighboring counties admired Tyler's careful restoration. Veterans posed for photographs beside it after finishing fence repairs. Children climbed onto the wide steel seat with their parents' permission, laughing as Jack explained how farms once depended on machines exactly like this one. The tractor had become the quiet heart of the workshop. Tyler continued making small adjustments every afternoon. "She's running," he told Jack, "but I want her running right." Together, they replaced worn seals, adjusted timing, rebuilt the hydraulic pump, and polished small pieces that no visitor would ever notice. Jack admired the young mechanic's patience. "You know," he said one evening, "Grandpa would have liked working beside you." Tyler smiled without looking up from the engine. "I wish I'd met him." "In some ways," Jack replied gently, "I think you have." While organizing another cabinet inside the workshop, Jack discovered one final maintenance journal hidden behind an old service manual. Unlike the earlier notebooks filled with repairs for neighboring farms, this one contained only entries about the old tractor itself. Every repair, every replacement part, every seasonal inspection had been carefully recorded across decades. Jack sat at Walter's workbench while Emily and Tyler gathered beside him. The final pages held fewer technical notes and more personal reflections than any journal they had seen before. Walter wrote about replacing bearings after spring planting, rebuilding the engine before harvest, and repainting the hood simply because, in his words, hard work deserves dignity. Near the end of the journal, Jack found one final entry written only months before Walter's health began failing. "People keep asking why I don't replace this old tractor with something newer. They think I'm keeping an old machine alive because I'm sentimental. They're wrong. This tractor reminds me that every repair matters. Every scratch on this metal came from another season when someone needed help. Every hour it worked beside another farmer meant one more family stayed on its land." Someday Jack may wonder why I cared so much about keeping it running. I hope he understands that I was never preserving a tractor. I was preserving every promise it helped me keep. Silence filled the workshop after Jack finished reading. Tyler slowly looked toward the tractor standing quietly nearby. So every time he wrote "old tractor" in the notebooks, Jack nodded. He wasn't just recording repairs. Emily smiled through tears. He was remembering people. Jack closed the journal carefully. At last he understood why Walter had never replaced the machine. It had become a living reminder that one repaired engine could keep an entire family farming through another season. One working tractor often meant another harvest, another mortgage payment, another year together on land that might otherwise have been lost. The real value had never been measured in horsepower. It had been measured in hope. Emily spent the following days organizing Walter's final journal alongside the maintenance notebooks, letters, and newspaper articles. Together, they created a small historical display inside one corner of the farmhouse so visitors could understand the story behind the restoration. Volunteers often paused there before beginning work, quietly reading Walter's words before walking back to the barns. The atmosphere across the property slowly changed. Repairs no longer felt like isolated projects. Every repaired fence, restored pump, and rebuilt machine seemed connected to something larger than construction. Jack realized he was no longer asking whether the farm could survive. Instead, he found himself planning how it would serve the community once again. Ben Harris stopped by one afternoon carrying updated inspection paperwork. "The buildings are looking good," he said. "Better every week." Jack smiled. "Still plenty left." "Not as much as there used to be." Ben looked toward the restored dairy barn where volunteers were finishing final improvements. "If everything stays on schedule, you'll be ready sooner than you think." Emily folded another newspaper clipping before looking up. "Ready for what?" Ben grinned. "Opening the gates again." The idea settled quietly over everyone gathered in the workshop. For months, they had focused only on the next repair, the next roof beam, the next broken machine. None of them had stopped to picture the day the farm would officially welcome people back. Jack looked toward the old tractor resting in the afternoon sunlight. "Then maybe it's time," he said softly. Before the volunteers left that evening, they gathered beside the workshop while Jack stood on the porch holding a handwritten notice, smiling at the familiar faces who had become part of Walter's legacy. He announced that, after years of silence, Morrison Dairy Farm would officially reopen its gates to the community the following month. Opening day arrived beneath a clear autumn sky that seemed to reward every difficult step taken during the past several months. Before sunrise, volunteers were already moving across the Morrison Dairy Farm, hanging wooden signs along freshly repaired fences, arranging benches beside the restored milking barn, and placing old photographs from Walter Morrison's collection inside the farmhouse where visitors could follow the story of the farm through generations. Jack stood quietly on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching headlights slowly appear along the county road. The same driveway that had once been hidden beneath weeds was now lined with neatly repaired fencing and fresh gravel. Emily joined him carrying a clipboard filled with schedules for the day. "Nervous?" she asked. Jack smiled. "More than I was before any army inspection." Emily laughed softly. "He'll be fine." He looked across the farm. "This isn't about me anymore." By the time the gates officially opened, dozens of vehicles had already gathered outside. Families stepped onto the property carrying children, cameras, and memories. Elderly couples walked slowly toward the farmhouse, pausing every few steps as familiar buildings brought back stories from decades earlier. Former dairy farmers returned wearing old work jackets with faded family names stitched above the pockets. Many had not visited the Morrison farm since Walter's funeral years before. Harold Benson arrived with his grandchildren. Ruth Morgan carried a framed photograph showing Walter standing beside her late husband, after repairing their flood-damaged tractor. One retired farmer brought a worn toolbox that Walter had once loaned him during harvest nearly 30 years earlier. "I figured it belonged back here," he told Jack with a smile. Throughout the morning, visitors wandered through the historical display Emily had carefully assembled inside the farmhouse. Walter's maintenance notebooks rested beneath glass alongside newspaper articles, handwritten letters, and faded photographs documenting quiet acts of kindness stretching across 4 decades. People often fell silent while reading the simple repair entries that carried no invoices, only names, dates, and machines returned to service. More than once, Jack noticed visitors wiping away tears before stepping outside again. Tyler guided small groups through the workshop, proudly explaining how volunteers had restored the old tractor piece by piece. Every tour ended beside the machine itself. Children climbed carefully onto the steel seat, while parents photographed them beneath the faded green hood. Tyler smiled every time someone asked if the tractor really still worked. "Would you like to hear it?" he asked. Moments later, the familiar engine came alive with its steady rumble, drawing smiles and applause from everyone nearby. It was no longer simply an old machine. It had become the heartbeat of the entire celebration. Ben Harris supervised the final inspection of the restored dairy equipment early that afternoon. After months of repairs, replacements, testing, and careful work by volunteers, every system passed its final operational checks. Water flowed properly through cleaned lines. Cooling systems maintained safe temperatures. Pumps operated smoothly. Jack stood beside Ben as the last inspection form received its official signature. Ben looked toward him and extended his hand. "Congratulations." Jack accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Couldn't have done it without you." Ben smiled. "That's exactly the point." Soon afterward, several local dairy farmers gently guided the first small group of healthy Holstein cows into the restored barn. Visitors gathered quietly along the viewing area, while the animals settled naturally into clean stalls prepared for them earlier that morning. Jack rested one hand against the wooden railing, remembering the silence that had once filled this building. Now the familiar sounds of cattle, footsteps, and working equipment echoed through the barn once more. The Morrison Dairy Farm was alive again. During the afternoon ceremony, community members gathered beneath a large maple tree near the farmhouse. Martha Collins spoke briefly about Walter's lifelong commitment to helping neighboring farms survive difficult seasons. Harold Benson thanked volunteers who had rebuilt more than barns. Ben Harris recognized the mechanics, carpenters, electricians, and farmers who had freely shared their knowledge. Finally, Emily stepped onto the small wooden platform carrying no prepared speech, only a folded page from Walter's journal. She looked first toward her father before facing the crowd. "A few months ago," she began, "I begged my dad to sell this farm because I believed it was only a burden." She smiled gently. "I wasn't wrong about how difficult this journey would be. I was wrong about what this place truly was." She paused as her eyes moved across the gathering. "Growing up, I thought my grandfather's legacy was this land, these barns, and these machines. After reading his journals, meeting the families he quietly helped, and watching all of you rebuild this farm together, I finally understand that his real legacy was never measured in acres or equipment." Her voice softened. "It was measured by people who refused to let one another face hard seasons alone." Emily turned toward Jack. "Dad, thank you for keeping the promise I almost asked you to break. Because you refused to give up, an entire community found its way home again." Applause spread across the crowd while Jack lowered his head, deeply moved. He embraced Emily as neighbors, friends, and volunteers rose to their feet. Tyler stood nearby smiling proudly, while Martha quietly wiped tears from behind her glasses. Even Ben Harris looked away for a moment before joining the applause. After the ceremony, local officials presented the Morrison Dairy Farm with a framed certificate recognizing its importance to the county's agricultural history and its contribution to preserving rural traditions. The recognition meant more to Jack than he expected, because it honored not only Walter, but every volunteer who had helped restore the farm. As the afternoon slowly drew toward evening, families continued walking through the barns. Children laughed beside the old tractor, and former farmers exchanged stories they had not shared in years. Jack wandered quietly among them, grateful simply to listen. Every smile, every conversation, every handshake reminded him that Walter had never worked alone. He had simply built relationships so strong they endured long after the repairs themselves were forgotten. Just before sunset, the county commissioner stepped onto the small stage once more and gently tapped the microphone. Conversations gradually faded as everyone turned toward him. He smiled warmly at Jack before looking across the gathered crowd. "Before we conclude today's celebration," he said, holding a sealed envelope in his hands, "there is one final announcement I have the honor of making." The county commissioner waited until the applause faded before opening the envelope in his hands. Behind him, the restored dairy barn stood proudly beneath the late afternoon sun, while the old tractor rested near the workshop, its faded green paint glowing warmly in the golden light. Jack stood beside Emily and Tyler at the front of the gathering, still overwhelmed by everything the day had already brought. He could not imagine there was anything more to celebrate. The commissioner smiled toward the crowd before speaking. "Today we have witnessed the reopening of more than a dairy farm." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "We have witnessed the return of a piece of our county's history." Families stood quietly beneath the maple tree. Many still held photographs taken throughout the afternoon. Others looked toward Walter's workshop, remembering stories that had been shared only hours earlier. The commissioner unfolded the document inside the envelope. After careful review by the County Historical Preservation Board, the Agricultural Heritage Council, and the Board of Commissioners, it is my honor to officially designate Morrison Dairy Farm as a protected agricultural heritage site. A wave of applause swept across the farm before he gently raised one hand. This designation does not transfer ownership. The Morrison family will continue to own and operate the farm exactly as Walter Morrison intended. Our purpose is to ensure that its history, its service to this community, and its legacy of helping neighboring families will never be forgotten. Jack lowered his head for a moment, overcome by emotion. He had returned to the property believing he had nothing left except broken buildings and impossible bills. Now, the very community his grandfather had quietly served for decades had chosen to preserve that legacy for generations yet to come. The commissioner stepped down from the stage, carrying a beautifully framed certificate. "Jack," he said warmly, "on behalf of everyone in this county, thank you for reminding us what real stewardship looks like." Jack accepted the frame with trembling hands. "I only finished what my grandfather started." The commissioner smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it." The crowd rose into another long-standing ovation. Jack looked around at the faces surrounding him. Harold Benson clapped proudly beside his grandchildren. Ruth Morgan smiled through happy tears. Ben Harris applauded with both hands raised high above his head. Martha Collins stood quietly with Walter's journals pressed gently against her chest. Tyler grinned like a young man who had just watched history come back to life. Emily reached for her father's hand without saying a word. In that moment, Jack understood that none of the applause belonged to him alone. It belonged to every volunteer who had repaired a roof, rebuilt a fence, restored a machine, shared a story, or simply believed an old dairy farm still mattered. As evening settled over the property, families slowly made their way home, carrying baskets of local products, photographs, and memories of a day many believed they would never see. Volunteers folded chairs, cleaned tables, and swept the workshop until everything once again reflected Walter's habit of leaving a place better than he found it. The farm gradually became quiet. Only a handful of people remained. Emily walked beside her father toward the porch just as the last streaks of sunlight crossed the pasture. "I've made a decision," she said softly. Jack looked at her. "I wondered if you had." She smiled. "I spoke with my employer this morning." He waited patiently. "I'm moving back home." Jack blinked, almost afraid he had misheard. Emily laughed gently through tears. "If you'll have me, I'd like to help manage the farm with you." Without hesitation, Jack wrapped his daughter in a long embrace. "I've wanted to hear those words for a very long time." Tyler approached a few moments later, carrying a folder of maintenance records. He hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Morrison." Jack smiled. "What's on your mind?" Tyler looked toward the workshop. "I'd like to stay involved, not just until everything is finished." Jack nodded. "Go on." "If you're willing, I'd like to become the farm's full-time mechanic. There's still plenty of equipment to maintain, and I'd like to keep learning here." Jack placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Walter believed every good farm needed someone who cared more about keeping things running than replacing them. Tyler smiled. "Sounds like the job I want. Then it's yours." Early the following morning, before the first visitors arrived, a local carpenter delivered one final piece that had been quietly prepared for weeks. Together, Jack, Emily, Tyler, Ben, Martha, and several longtime volunteers gathered near the entrance to the property where the old weathered sign had greeted travelers for decades. They carefully removed the faded board and replaced it with a beautifully crafted oak sign protected beneath a canvas cover. Jack stepped forward and gently pulled away the cloth. Carved into polished wood were simple words that perfectly reflected Walter's life. Morrison Dairy Farm, built on hard work, sustained by kindness. Nobody spoke for several moments. The sign needed no further explanation. It told the entire story. As the others returned to their morning work, Jack walked alone toward the machine shed. The old tractor waited exactly where it had rested since yesterday's celebration. He climbed slowly into the seat, turned the key, and smiled as the familiar engine immediately came to life with its deep, steady rumble. Unlike the hesitant cough that had first broken years of silence, the engine now ran smoothly, confidently, as though it had been waiting for this morning all along. Jack guided the tractor slowly across the pasture while sunlight spread over repaired fences, restored barns, and fields ready for another season. He stopped near the highest hill overlooking the farm and switched off the engine. Silence settled gently around him. He reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded Walter's first note one final time. "If the old tractor ever runs again, you'll know this farm still has work to do." At last, Jack understood. Walter had never cared about preserving an old tractor simply because it had served him well. The tractor had represented every promise he made to a struggling neighbor, every late night spent repairing another family's future, every season saved because someone chose compassion over convenience. The notebooks had never been about machinery. They had been a record of people. Every repair listed inside them marked another family that stayed on its land because one man quietly refused to let them face hardship alone. The real legacy had never been steel, gears, or engines. It had always been the community those repairs had built. Jack folded the note carefully and looked across the Morrison dairy farm one last time. The buildings stood strong again. The workshop echoed with purpose. Emily had come home. Tyler had found his calling. Neighbors had become family once more. The farm was open again. Not because one old machine had been restored, but because kindness had continued its work through another generation. And as the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh pasture across the fields, Jack smiled, knowing his grandfather had been right all along. As long as people kept helping one another, the farm would always have work to do, and the Morrison legacy would never truly come to an end. Sometimes, the greatest victories in life aren't measured by the battles we win, the money we earn, or the possessions we keep. Sometimes they're measured by the promises we refuse to break. Jack Morrison thought he had returned to his grandfather's farm because he had nowhere else to go. In truth, he had been led back to the one place that could remind him who he had always been. He believed he was restoring broken buildings, repairing worn-out machines, and bringing an old dairy farm back to life. But what he truly rebuilt was something far more valuable: a legacy of kindness, a community that had almost forgotten its own strength, and a future where one simple act of helping another person could still change countless lives. Walter Morrison never wanted to be remembered for owning an old tractor. He wanted to be remembered for never letting a neighbor face a hard season alone. And perhaps that's the lesson this story leaves with all of us. We may never own a farm. We may never rebuild an old tractor. But every one of us has the opportunity to become the reason someone else keeps going when life feels impossible. Sometimes all it takes is one helping hand, one encouraging word, or one promise kept. Thank you for spending this time with us and for sharing in Jack's journey. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you the most. If you believe kindness still matters, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of hope, family, resilience, and second chances. Until our next story, take care of yourself, take care of the people around you, and never underestimate how much good one ordinary person can do. We'll see you in the next journey.